The easiest person to ignore is the one you assume has nothing to offer. The executive conference room on the 40th floor overlooked nearly the entire Chicago skyline. Morning sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling glass walls, reflecting across a polished walnut table that stretched more than 20 feet from end to end. Around it sat some of the most influential people in the company. Vice presidents reviewed reports. Department heads organized presentations. Financial analysts prepared forecasts for the upcoming fiscal year. At the center of it all sat Christopher Hayes, the company's celebrated chief executive officer. Confident, composed, and accustomed to controlling every conversation in the room, he opened the meeting with a brief welcome before immediately shifting into business. Several executives shared updates. Others presented growth projections. Questions moved around the table. Opinions were requested. Suggestions were discussed. Near the far end of the conference table sat Monica Reynolds. She wore a navy business suit, carried a worn leather portfolio, and listened carefully to every presentation. Unlike most people in the room, she did not interrupt. She did not compete for attention. She simply observed. 15 minutes into the meeting, Monica raised her hand slightly. Christopher glanced in her direction. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Then he turned toward someone else. "Michael, what are your thoughts?" The conversation continued. Monica lowered her hand. No reaction crossed her face. A few minutes later, another presentation began. Revenue forecasts appeared across a large digital screen mounted on the wall. As executives debated projections, Monica once again attempted to contribute. "I believe there may be something worth considering regarding those numbers." Christopher looked directly at her. Then, without acknowledging her comment, he turned toward the chief financial officer. "Sarah, can you walk us through the risk assessment?" A subtle silence followed. Several people around the table noticed what had happened. Monica noticed too, yet she remained calm. She opened her portfolio and quietly reviewed a page of notes. Outside the glass walls, sunlight illuminated the city below. Inside, the meeting continued. Another 20 minutes passed. Strategic initiatives were discussed. Expansion plans were debated. New partnerships were evaluated. Throughout the entire conversation, Christopher invited opinions from nearly everyone at the table. Everyone except Monica. By now the pattern had become impossible to miss. Some executives exchanged uncertain looks. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Monica remained composed. She listened carefully and took notes. The more she was ignored, the calmer she seemed to become. Christopher interpreted that silence as confirmation that she had little to contribute. What he failed to notice was that Monica's notes were becoming increasingly detailed. Every overlooked risk, every questionable assumption, every flaw hidden inside the company's ambitious plans. Finally, nearly an hour into the meeting, Monica raised her hand for a third time. The room grew slightly quieter. Several executives waited to see what would happen. Christopher glanced toward her once more. Then he looked away and called on someone sitting 3 seats farther down the table. A faint tension settled over the room. Nobody said anything. Nobody challenged the decision. Yet everyone had seen it. And for the first time that morning, people were no longer paying attention to the presentation on the screen. They were paying attention to the woman Christopher Hayes seemed determined to pretend was not there. Monica Reynolds had spent most of her professional life in rooms exactly like this one. Boardrooms, investment meetings, strategic planning sessions, places where decisions worth millions of dollars were often made in less time than it took to drink a cup of coffee. Yet unlike many people seated around the conference table, she had never been interested in being the loudest voice in the room. She preferred listening, watching, understanding how people treated one another when they believed nobody important was paying attention. As another presentation appeared on the digital screen, Monica quietly turned a page in her notebook. Her handwriting was precise and organized. Small observations filled the margins beside financial projections and growth forecasts. She recorded numbers, but she also recorded behavior. Which executives listened carefully? Which ones interrupted others? Which people received attention? Which people were ignored? Across the table, several department leaders continued discussing expansion opportunities in emerging markets. Christopher Hayes guided the conversation with complete confidence. Every question seemed directed toward the same group of familiar voices. The same executives, the same advisors, the same people he trusted. Monica remained invisible, at least in his eyes. A young financial analyst named Ethan sat several seats away reviewing a complicated forecasting model projected on the screen. His hands trembled slightly as he presented. The numbers were solid, but public speaking clearly made him nervous. Halfway through his presentation, one of the charts displayed an incorrect growth percentage. Ethan froze. His face immediately flushed with embarrassment. Several executives noticed the mistake. A few exchanged impatient looks. Christopher leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. The silence in the room became uncomfortable. Ethan attempted to explain the discrepancy, but struggled to find the correct data. Before anyone else spoke, Monica quietly slid a sheet of paper across the table. Ethan looked down. On the page, she had written the corrected calculation along with the exact location of the spreadsheet error. Relief instantly appeared on his face. "Thank you," he said softly. Monica simply nodded. Ethan adjusted the presentation and continued. The meeting moved forward without further problems. Most people barely noticed what had happened, but a few did. One vice president glanced toward Monica with curiosity. Another executive offered a small appreciative smile. Monica returned her attention to her notes. She never mentioned helping Ethan. She never sought recognition. Outside the towering glass windows, sunlight reflected from neighboring skyscrapers, casting shifting patterns of light across the conference room walls. Inside, the meeting continued. Nearly 90 minutes had passed. Since it began, Christopher asked for opinions regarding staffing strategies. He asked for opinions regarding marketing. He asked for opinions regarding expansion timelines. Monica watched as nearly every person at the table contributed. Every person except her. Eventually, she raised her hand once again. Not dramatically, not insistently. Simply as a professional trying to participate in a discussion. Christopher saw her immediately. Several others saw her too. For a brief second it appeared he might finally acknowledge her. Instead, he turned toward another executive. "Jennifer, what are your thoughts?" The room grew noticeably quieter. Monica slowly lowered her hand and wrote another note inside her notebook. This time she did not look disappointed. She looked thoughtful, and somewhere around the conference table, people were beginning to realize that the woman Christopher Hayes kept overlooking might be the most interesting person in the entire room. Christopher Hayes had spent nearly 2 decades building a reputation as one of the most respected executives in the industry. Business journals praised his leadership. Financial networks invited him for interviews. Investors described him as decisive. Inside the company, employees often used a different word. Certain. Christopher possessed an almost unshakable belief in his own judgment. Most of the time, that confidence worked in his favor. It allowed him to make difficult decisions quickly. It helped him navigate crises. It gave others confidence in his leadership. Yet certainty carried a hidden danger. When a person became convinced they could accurately measure someone's value within seconds of meeting them, they often stopped listening. As the strategy meeting continued, Christopher remained focused on the people he considered most important around the table. Senior executives received his full attention. Longtime advisors received thoughtful questions. Department heads received opportunities to elaborate on their ideas. Monica Reynolds received silence. Outside the conference room windows, clouds drifted slowly across the Chicago skyline. Sunlight reflected against neighboring towers and painted moving patterns across the polished table. Inside, another presentation began. Market expansion projections filled the large digital display mounted on the wall. Christopher listened carefully while executives debated future growth opportunities. Several people disagreed with one another. Christopher welcomed the discussion. In his mind, healthy disagreement produced stronger decisions. Ironically, the one perspective he never bothered to consider was sitting less than 20 feet away. Monica continued taking notes. Her leather portfolio remained open beside her, page after page filled with observations, not only about financial risks, but about the culture inside the room itself. She watched who was respected, who was interrupted, who received opportunities to speak. Most importantly, she noticed who controlled the conversation. A vice president named Karen suggested expanding into several new regional markets within 18 months. Christopher nodded approvingly. Others quickly expressed support. Monica reviewed the numbers displayed on the screen. Almost immediately she noticed a problem. The timeline appeared far more aggressive than the available resources could realistically support. She raised her hand once again. Several people noticed. Christopher noticed too. For a brief moment, Karen even paused speaking as though expecting Monica to contribute. Instead, Christopher leaned forward and addressed someone else. David, do you agree with Karen's assessment? David immediately began offering his opinion. Monica lowered her hand. No frustration crossed her face. No visible reaction at all. Yet a few people around the table looked increasingly uncomfortable. Ethan certainly did. After Monica had quietly helped save his presentation earlier, he found himself paying closer attention. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Christopher was not accidentally overlooking her. He was choosing to. Nearly 2 hours into the meeting, a short break was announced. Executives stood, stretched, and gathered near the coffee station along one side of the room. Conversations filled the space. Monica remained seated for a moment before closing her notebook. As she did, a folded document slipped partially from her portfolio. Only a corner was visible. Yet Ethan happened to glance toward it. His eyes widened slightly. The document carried investment figures unlike anything he had ever seen. Before he could read further, Monica calmly returned it to the portfolio and stood. Then she walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, leaving behind a room full of people who still had no idea who she really was. The break lasted only 15 minutes, but when everyone returned to the conference table, the atmosphere felt subtly different. Conversations became quieter. Several executives glanced toward Monica Reynolds before taking their seats. Ethan certainly did. He could not stop thinking about the document he had briefly seen inside her portfolio. The numbers had been enormous, far beyond anything associated with an ordinary consultant or observer. Yet Monica gave no indication that anything unusual had happened. She returned to her seat near the end of the table, opened her notebook, and prepared for the next presentation with the same calm professionalism she had displayed all morning. Christopher Hayes resumed control of the meeting immediately. A new series of slides appeared on the large screen, outlining the company's most ambitious expansion strategy in years. Charts filled with projected revenue growth, hiring plans, and development schedules stretched across the display. Several executives nodded approvingly as the proposal was presented. Christopher appeared especially pleased. He described the initiative as transformative, a defining moment for the company's future. Around the table, people listened carefully. Monica listened too. The difference was that she was examining every assumption hidden beneath the presentation. Within minutes, she noticed a significant concern. The projected growth depended upon several conditions occurring simultaneously. Market performance, hiring targets, supply chain expansion, and financing timelines all needed to align almost perfectly. In her experience, plans built upon perfect conditions rarely remained perfect for long. She reviewed the figures once more. The risk was obvious. Monica slowly raised her hand. This time several people immediately noticed. The vice president sitting beside her stopped taking notes. Ethan looked up from his laptop. Even Karen glanced across the table. Christopher saw her as well. For a brief moment, the room seemed to pause. Then he continued speaking as though nothing had happened. Now let us hear from operations, he said. Monica lowered her hand once again. The presentation moved forward. 20 minutes later, another executive discussed projected staffing requirements. The numbers appeared optimistic. Too optimistic. Monica carefully compared them against earlier projections. The discrepancy was significant enough to affect the entire strategy. Once again, she attempted to contribute. There may be a concern regarding the hiring timeline. Christopher did not even look in her direction. We are running short on time, he replied while addressing the room. Let us stay focused on solutions. A faint discomfort spread around the table. The response felt increasingly difficult to ignore. Monica had not challenged anyone. She had not interrupted. She had simply attempted to participate. Yet each effort was dismissed before it could begin. Across the room, sunlight reflected against the glass walls and cast long patterns across the polished conference table. Monica quietly wrote another note inside her notebook. Her expression remained thoughtful rather than frustrated. That composure only made the situation more noticeable. Eventually, a junior project manager began presenting a complicated implementation schedule. Halfway through the presentation, confusion appeared on his face. Several key milestones were out of sequence. The mistake threatened to derail the discussion. Before anyone else reacted, Monica slid a page of notes toward him. The young manager looked down and immediately understood the correction. Relief appeared across his face. He adjusted the schedule and continued successfully. Once again, Monica asked for nothing in return. No acknowledgement. No praise. No recognition. Several executives noticed. Christopher did not. Or perhaps he chose not to. As the meeting continued, more people around the table found themselves watching Monica instead of the presentation. Not because she demanded attention, because despite being ignored at every opportunity, she continued helping everyone around her succeed. Nearly 3 hours had passed since the meeting began, and what started as a routine strategic review had slowly transformed into something else entirely. The presentations continued. The charts became more ambitious. The forecasts became more optimistic. Yet beneath the polished language and confident projections, Monica Reynolds could see the same problem appearing again and again. Assumptions were being treated as guarantees. Risks were being treated as inconveniences. And the one person attempting to address those concerns had been effectively erased from the conversation. The afternoon sunlight now poured through the towering glass walls at a sharper angle, casting long bands of light across the conference table. Several executives looked tired. Coffee cups had accumulated beside laptops and notebooks. Even Christopher Hayes appeared eager to move toward final approval of the company's expansion strategy. "I believe we are ready to proceed," he announced confidently. "This plan positions us for unprecedented growth over the next 3 years." A few executives nodded. Others exchanged uncertain looks. Monica reviewed the final summary displayed on the screen. The numbers were impressive. They were also dangerously dependent on assumptions that could change overnight. For a moment, she considered remaining silent. After all, every attempt to contribute had been ignored. Every effort to participate had been dismissed. Yet responsibility mattered more to her than pride. She slowly raised her hand once again. This time the room noticed immediately. Several people actually stopped taking notes. Ethan looked up from his laptop. Karen glanced toward Monica. Even the junior project manager she had helped earlier seemed to hold his breath. Christopher saw her. The silence lasted 2 full seconds. Then he looked away. "Before we conclude," he said, addressing the room, "I would like final comments from senior leadership." A visible discomfort spread across the table. The pattern was now impossible for anyone to deny. Monica lowered her hand and calmly closed her notebook. Christopher continued speaking. "This expansion represents the future of our company." As he spoke, Monica opened her leather portfolio and removed several documents. She quietly compared them against the projections on the screen. The discrepancies remained exactly where she expected them to be. Financing assumptions, hiring capacity, market volatility, supply chain exposure. None of the risks had disappeared simply because nobody wanted to discuss them. Across the room, Ethan could no longer focus on the presentation. The document he had glimpsed earlier remained fixed in his memory. The investment figures, the signatures, the names attached to them. Something about Monica's presence in the room made less and less sense. Why would someone with access to information like that sit quietly for hours while being ignored? Unless she already understood something everyone else did not. Christopher moved toward a formal recommendation. "If there are no significant objections, we can begin implementation next quarter." Monica slowly looked up. For the first time all day, a trace of disappointment appeared in her eyes. Not because she had been ignored, because an entire room full of intelligent people was preparing to make an avoidable mistake. She carefully placed one document on top of her portfolio. A figure printed across the page caught Ethan's attention from several seats away. His eyes widened. The number was astonishing. Before he could process it, the conference room door opened. Several heads turned. Standing in the doorway was Richard Bennett, chairman of the board. His arrival was unexpected. His expression suggested urgency. And the moment his eyes found Monica Reynolds sitting at the far end of the table, everything in the room seemed to change. The conference room fell unusually quiet the moment Richard Bennett stepped through the doorway. Conversations stopped. Laptops remained open but forgotten. Even the steady hum of the projector seemed louder against the sudden silence. Richard rarely interrupted executive meetings, especially meetings of this importance. His presence alone commanded attention. Yet what drew everyone's notice was not that he had entered the room. It was where he was looking. His eyes moved directly to Monica Reynolds. A warm smile appeared on his face. "Monica," he said, "I apologize for being delayed." The room became even quieter. Several executives exchanged confused glances. Christopher Hayes looked from Richard to Monica and back again. Monica simply closed her portfolio and offered a polite nod. "No problem, Richard." The familiarity between them caught everyone off guard. Richard walked toward the conference table and took a seat near the center of the room. Before addressing anyone else, he turned back toward Monica. "Have you had an opportunity to share your thoughts on the expansion proposal?" The question lingered in the air. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Christopher shifted slightly in his chair. Monica glanced toward the large presentation screen. "Not yet," she replied calmly. Richard's expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for several people to notice. "Not yet," he repeated. Monica's voice remained measured. There never seemed to be an appropriate moment. Across the table, Ethan lowered his eyes. Karen looked toward Christopher. Several executives suddenly found the papers in front of them very interesting. Richard slowly surveyed the room. Years of leadership had taught him how to read people quickly. He sensed the tension immediately. Yet instead of questioning anyone, he simply nodded. "I see." Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the afternoon sun hung low above the Chicago skyline. Golden light washed across the conference room and reflected along the polished surface of the table. Monica looked toward the city for a moment. Thousands of buildings stretched toward the horizon. Thousands of people moved through lives filled with decisions, opportunities, and consequences. Then she looked back at the documents resting inside her portfolio. Quietly, she opened it. Inside were reports, agreements, projections, and ownership records accumulated over many years. She ran her fingertips lightly across the edge of a single document before closing the portfolio again. Her expression revealed neither anger nor satisfaction, only reflection. Richard watched her for a moment. Then he looked toward the presentation materials displayed on the screen. "Before we proceed," he said calmly, "I would like to hear Monica's perspective." The request sounded simple, reasonable, professional, yet an unexpected tension immediately spread through the room. Because for the first time all day, the person who had been overlooked was finally being invited to speak. And somewhere deep inside, Christopher Hayes felt a growing sense of unease he could not explain. He had spent hours treating Monica Reynolds as though her opinion carried no weight. Now the chairman of the board had paused an entire meeting to hear it. Sunlight continued pouring through the glass walls as complete silence settled over the conference room. Every executive turned toward Monica. Every eye waited. Monica slowly folded her hands on top of her portfolio and prepared to speak. Every eye in the conference room remained fixed on Monica Reynolds. The silence felt almost unreal after hours of presentations, debates, and discussions. Outside the glass walls, the Chicago skyline glowed beneath the late afternoon sun. Inside, nobody moved. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody glanced at a laptop screen. For the first time that day, the entire room was prepared to listen. Monica folded her hands on top of her leather portfolio and looked toward the presentation projected on the screen. Her voice was calm, steady, professional. "The expansion strategy contains several strengths," she began. "The market opportunities are real. The demand projections are promising. The leadership team is capable." A few executives nodded. Christopher Hayes relaxed slightly in his chair. Then Monica continued. "However, the plan also relies on assumptions that create significant exposure." The room immediately became attentive. Monica rose from her seat and walked toward the display screen. Without any hesitation, she identified one projection after another. Hiring targets that exceeded realistic staffing capacity. Financing timelines that assumed ideal. Market conditions. Revenue forecasts built upon optimistic growth scenarios. Supply chain dependencies with limited contingency planning. Each observation was precise. Each concern was supported by data. One by one, executives began reviewing their notes. Some exchanged surprised looks. Others quietly reopened spreadsheets on their laptops. Christopher felt a growing sense of discomfort. Not because Monica was wrong, because she was right. The flaws she identified were obvious once she pointed them out. Yet somehow nobody had addressed them, including him. Monica returned to her seat. "These issues can be corrected," she said. "But they should be corrected before implementation begins." Complete silence followed. Richard Bennett smiled faintly. "That is exactly why I wanted everyone to hear your perspective." Several executives nodded in agreement. Ethan looked almost relieved. The room suddenly felt different. The woman who had been ignored for hours had just provided the most valuable analysis of the entire meeting. Christopher opened his mouth to respond, but Richard spoke first. There is something else this group should probably understand. The chairman looked around the table. Confusion spread across several faces. Richard rested one hand on the conference table. Many of you know Monica as an advisor. A few executives nodded. Some know her as a consultant. More nods followed. Richard smiled toward Monica. What many of you do not know is that Monica Reynolds has played a much larger role in this company's success than most people realize. Christopher frowned slightly. The room became quiet once more. Richard continued. 12 years ago, when expansion funding was uncertain and several major institutions declined participation, one investment group chose to believe in this company. He paused. That group was led by Monica Reynolds. Several executives looked stunned. Ethan immediately remembered the figures he had glimpsed earlier. Richard was not finished. Over the years, her organization committed more than $700 million to support our growth. The words seemed to echo through the conference room. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Christopher stared at Monica as if seeing her for the first time. $700 million. The number felt impossible. Yet the calm woman sitting quietly beside the window showed no reaction. Richard's voice softened. Without her support, this company would not be where it is today. A stunned silence settled across the room. And for the first time all day, Christopher Hayes realized the person he had spent hours ignoring might be the most important person at the entire table. For several long seconds, nobody in the conference room spoke. The revelation hung in the air like a weight nobody knew how to carry. $700 million. The number alone was staggering. Yet what unsettled people most was not the amount. It was the realization that the woman who had provided one of the most important investments in the company's history had spent nearly an entire day being treated as though her voice did not matter. The afternoon sunlight continued pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the conference room in warm gold. Monica Reynolds remained seated calmly beside the glass, her portfolio closed, her expression unchanged. She looked exactly the same as she had looked when the meeting began. Christopher Hayes, however, felt as though the room itself had shifted beneath him. Every ignored hand raised returned to his memory. Every time he redirected the conversation. Every opportunity he had denied her. Richard Bennett remained silent, allowing the moment to settle. Around the table, executives avoided eye contact. Ethan stared at the notes in front of him. Karen slowly closed her laptop. Nobody seemed interested in the expansion proposal anymore. Christopher finally cleared his throat. Monica, he began quietly. The confidence that normally defined his voice was gone. Monica looked toward him. Yes. Christopher paused. For perhaps the first time in years, he struggled to find the right words. I owe you an apology. The room remained silent. Not because of your investment, he continued, and not because of your position. He lowered his eyes briefly. I owe you an apology because I spent this entire meeting treating your perspective as though it did not deserve to be heard. Monica listened without interruption. Christopher continued. You tried to contribute. You identified risks that should have been discussed. You helped people throughout this room succeed. And I ignored you. No one moved. No one looked away. That was my failure. Monica folded her hands together and studied him for a moment. Her response came softly. Christopher, do you know what surprised me most today? He slowly shook his head. You never asked a single question about what I thought. The statement landed harder than anyone expected. Monica glanced around the table. The investment is not the point. Her voice remained calm. The title is not the point. The money is not the point. Sunlight reflected across the polished table between them. The problem is that long before anyone knew who I was, a decision had already been made about how much value my voice carried. Several executives lowered their eyes. Christopher felt the truth of her words immediately. Monica opened her portfolio and carefully removed a document. The room watched as she placed it on the table. Richard recognized it instantly. So did a few senior executives. Christopher's expression tightened. The document contained a formal notice regarding her investment position. Monica looked directly at him. You ignored my perspective long before you ignored my money. Then she gently slid the document forward. After careful consideration, I have decided to withdraw our $700 million investment commitment. The silence that followed felt endless. The conference room remained completely silent long after Monica Reynolds slid the document across the polished table. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody attempted to argue. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows and bathed the room in gold, creating a strange contrast to the heaviness settling over everyone present. The expansion plans displayed on the large screen suddenly felt distant and unimportant. For hours, the meeting had revolved around projections, strategies, and future opportunities. Now it revolved around something much larger. Character. Christopher. Hayes stared at the document resting on the table. The formal withdrawal notice looked surprisingly ordinary for something capable of changing the future of an entire company. He slowly looked up at Monica. She showed no anger, no satisfaction, no desire for revenge. The calm dignity she carried at the beginning of the day remained unchanged. That realization somehow made the lesson even harder to ignore. Richard Bennett quietly reviewed the document before setting it down. Around the table, executives exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan looked toward Monica with admiration. Karen sat silently, reflecting on every moment she had witnessed throughout the day. Monica gathered her notebook and closed her leather portfolio. The same portfolio she had carried into the room hours earlier. The same portfolio Christopher had never bothered to ask about. She stood slowly. "I genuinely hope the company succeeds," she said. Her voice remained warm and sincere. "Many talented people work here." Several executives lowered their eyes. Monica continued. "The concerns I raised can still be addressed. The risks can still be managed. The future is still yours to shape." Christopher listened carefully. Every word felt important. But respect cannot depend on discovering someone's title after the fact. The room fell quiet once more. Monica looked around the conference table. The most valuable voice in a room is not always the loudest one. And it is not always the person sitting closest to power. Nobody disagreed. Nobody could. Outside the glass walls, the city stretched toward the horizon beneath a sky painted with shades of gold and blue. Monica picked up her portfolio and offered a small nod to Richard. Then she turned toward the door. As she passed Ethan, he stood. "Thank you," he said quietly. Monica smiled. "Keep asking questions. It will take you farther than certainty ever will." Ethan nodded. He would remember those words for the rest of his career. Monica continued toward the exit. The conference room door opened softly and closed behind her. No dramatic speeches followed. No one chased after her. The silence she left behind said more than any argument ever could. Christopher remained seated long after everyone else stopped looking at him. The city reflected across the glass beside him. For the first time all day, he noticed the empty chair where Monica had spent hours trying to contribute. He thought about every opportunity he had ignored, every question he never asked, every assumption he had made. The loss of $700 million would create challenges. But deep down, he understood that was not the greatest cost. The greater loss was realizing that he had failed to recognize wisdom when it sat directly across from him. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the Chicago skyline, the conference room grew quieter. The projections remained on the screen. The reports remained on the table. Yet the most important lesson from the entire meeting lingered in the silence left behind by a woman who never needed to raise her voice to be heard.